Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for turning up. That's just after 7:30. Very nice to see you all. I'm really excited about this evening because Jeffrey Kripal is a man absolutely after my own heart, and he represents the kind of thing that got me into these spiritual questionings. He's a polymath. He's a professor at Rice University there in Texas, in Houston, and he's a man who has various attributes, including a sense of humor and a capacity to understand foreign languages, which appeal to me enormously. He's a theologian, really, and he has had a very varied intellectual career. And it's that, the slogan for these talks is open minds, open minds. Well, here's an open mind. This is a man who's written a book about Ramakrishna. I'm pleased to say rather a controversial book about him. He's big in the SRLN Institute, which is one of the best institutes, like the Arthur Conan Doyle Center, only much bigger and with better weather on the California coast. And he's written books on things which mostly are anagrams of each other, such as the erotic, the esoteric, the ethical, the mystical, and the Gnostic. I mean, you could have a word game based on all those. And he's written a lot of interesting books. And at the moment, and he's an expert on American counterculture, on religious history. And his most recent book is a short but very sharp book called The Flip, which is about scientists and intellectuals and all those people who nowadays aren't supposed to have too much of an interest in the spiritual or the religious or whatever, but people who flipped, had their road to Damascus experience and turned into something else. And how could they do that? How do you fit that together? Why did A.J. Ayer, the greatest atheist of the early 20th century, turn out to have had an esoteric experience such that he could no longer believe what he'd always believed? Anyway, you don't need any more of me. What we really want is a bit more of Jeffrey, who is going to talk to us tonight about superhumanity, whatever that means. We'll find out right now. Jeffrey, nice to see you.
Thank you, Lance. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for having me. I appreciate being here. I see some familiar names and a lot of unfamiliar names, which is good. So Lance, I'm going to talk for 3 hours then. Is that the deal?
Of course, yes. Everybody's ready for that. They've all had their dinner,
Okay, good. No, my assumption was I'd talk for 30 or 40 minutes and then we'd have a conversation. I mean, I'd much rather hear from people what they want to talk about. I think once I can set these ideas out on a table in 30 or so minutes, and then we can, and I can talk longer too. I mean,
well, okay, maybe people could put questions and comments in the chat and then we can take it from there. Let's see how that goes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a professional blabber, and so I can fill any time slot you give me. That's what I do. So, but I'll try to keep this short because I think that's most productive. So, let me talk first about what the Germans and New Testament criticism called the Sitzenleben, the situation in life that produces a body of work. The Sitzenleben and New Testament criticism is essentially what were the historical circumstances that produced this or that biblical text. And I'm not going to be talking about the Bible, so don't be afraid. But I do want to talk about my own Sitzenleben and why I'm thinking about these things and why that might be helpful to you and why that may not be helpful to you. I don't know. So I work at a secular research university. I grew up Roman Catholic. I wanted to be a monk. I was trained in a monastic seminary, and I had what I would call contemplative or spiritual interests in mind for my vocation. That did not work out for a variety of I think ultimately good reasons. And so, like a lot of people in the study of religion, I backed into the field. Nobody grows up saying, I want to be a professor of religion. That is one weird kid. Nobody says that. What happens is people grow up in very different religious communities, usually, not always, and they have a question or they have some existential crisis that actually cannot be answered and sometimes can't even be asked in the categories of that community or that tradition. And so they back into the academy because it's really the only place in Western culture that not only allows you to have these heterodox questions, but actually encourages that and in some sense rewards that. And that's essentially what happened to me. I grew up in the Midwest, and ultimately backed into the study of religion at the University of Chicago is where I really landed, which is another private secular university here in the States. I've taught the comparative study of religion now for about, depending on how you count it, about 25 years. And I moved out of teaching full time, and I mostly work in administration now. I work at a dean's office, which kind of gives me a meta view or a higher view of the university and how it works and how the different schools relate and how people are hired, how they get tenure, how they don't get tenure, how they're not hired, how graduate students get jobs. So I kind of have a much, I think, a much more capacious understanding of higher education, at least in the US. I've also, over the last 20 years, have traveled a lot. Um, Before COVID, the way we did this was by traveling. And I took about 100 lecture trips, both in Europe and the US primarily at colleges and universities, but often institutes or research centers like your own. And I say that not to sound like a resume, but to emphasize that in all of those places, I had dinner with colleagues and students and interested readers and just people interested in the ideas. We talked. I heard a lot of stories that you'd never hear in print or in the public. And that really has shaped and informed how I think of higher education. And I'm very concerned about higher education. I'm very concerned about, in particular, the humanities. In the US, certainly, the US, I can't speak for England, but the US has grown increasingly anti intellectual, if not, frankly, dangerous, and a kind of rejection of expertise and knowledge and science. And so we're kind of in a fairly scary point now in American history. And I'm very concerned about the humanities. Departments are being shut down. Federal grants are being removed. I mean, it's a dangerous moment. And I work in a field, the comparative study of religion, that no one knows about or no one understands. When I'm asked on a plane, for example, what I do, I always try to avoid the question because I don't really want to talk to the person, and B, I know what questions are coming. I just say I'm a professor, and then of course they say, well, what do you teach? And then I have to say something like religion, and then they immediately launch into a sermon and tell me the truth of the cosmos, or the conversation ends and they go back to whatever they're doing. So it's a topic that has no, at least in the States, has no basis in the elementary and high school system. Nobody comes to colleges and universities wanting to major in the study of religion. They've never even heard of it. They come wanting to study chemistry or biology or mathematics or be a doctor. They have some kind of STEM-oriented perspective in mind, but they've never really studied literature or philosophy, or much less religion or anthropology or sociology. So it's a struggle. It's a constant struggle to explain to people what it is humanists do and why it's so important. And by a humanist, I don't mean a secular humanist or a philosophical humanist. I mean simply someone who works in the humanities. So that's been my main concern, and my interest in what we might call anomalous phenomena or psychical phenomena, or what's today called paranormal phenomena, really comes out of two sources. I was not trained to look at any of this. I had a very kind of I had a wonderful graduate education at the University of Chicago in the study of Hinduism and the history of Christian mysticism, but we never talked about these things. They were completely off the table. Um, you could talk all you wanted about mystical experience or even spirituality or the history of this or that, but you couldn't really talk about, say, a miracle or a spontaneous healing, much less a magical event, as anything other than a legend or something that someone made up for some kind of um, ideological or political reason. In other words, miracle stories were designed to accrue power and authority for institutions. They were not based on anything that actually happened. That was the assumption I was trained in. So as I often tell the story, we all read William James. We read his The Varieties of Religious Experience, but no one ever told us that James actually founded the American Society for Psychical Research and spent much of his life sitting with mediums and seances. We had no idea that was never mentioned. So there was just you could study certain things, but other things were just off the table. And it wasn't that there was a committee somewhere preventing you from doing that. It was just that there was no support for that. There was no encouragement. There was nothing. There was no interest in that. So two things happened. One is from about 2000 to 2010 or so, I was working on a history of the American counterculture and the Esalen Institute that Lance was referring to earlier. And I was going out to California a lot, and I was just hanging out and getting to know these historical actors. And they were telling me stories or things that had happened to them that by my training couldn't have happened, but that I knew happened because I knew these people and I knew they weren't lying to me. And so I became really interested in that, intellectually speaking, because it didn't fit in to my assumptions. And I was really curious why my field, which presumably would study these things, study religion, presumably would be interested in miracles and impossible stories, but didn't. And so I got really interested in that as an intellectual. Intellectuals, I think, I would say that a real intellectual is always really interested in what doesn't fit in and what cannot be explained by the model or science or philosophy of the time. I think that's what they're most interested in. And so I was sort of attracted to these phenomena, not because I understood them, but precisely because I didn't understand them. And I became more and more convinced that actually no one understands them. Uh, the longer I'm in this field, the more clear that is that we clearly do not understand this. Um, so those two things together really shaped and informed me. And I also then wrote a book on the intellectual history of the paranormal. And what I found was that all of these categories, the psychical, the telepathy, the paranormal, parapsychology itself, psi, all of these categories were created by scientists and philosophers and intellectuals in universities, actually, usually. They did not originate in popular culture or in what we dismissively call the tabloids today, but they originated in higher education. And then over the course of the 20th century, they entered popular culture and they were dismissed by intellectuals for a variety of reasons. And so I got really interested in that. And I also got very concerned about that. And because I train students, I train undergraduate students and graduate students, PhD students, I'm very concerned about their professional welfare. And I've become convinced that if we're going to make any progress in these areas, we have to establish these as academic disciplines in our universities, and we have to fund them, and they have to have a generational component. They can't just be one-offs. They can't be about wealthy individuals going off and doing this for 30 years. because there's no way to transmit that knowledge effectively to the next generation and to younger people. You need to establish journals, you need to establish departments, you need to do what the sciences have done essentially to continue and to develop a long-range multi-generational inquiry. And so I just sort of adopted this idea that, well, if there was anything I could do to help here, it's to sort of ground this in the gut of the American Academy and start to articulate these ideas in a way that academics could not only hear, but accept. And so that's really kind of what I do today. That's my goal. I interact a lot with what you might call popular culture. I interact with screenwriters. I interact with comic book creators. I interact with podcasts and bloggers and all these things you can imagine. But what I really want to do is somehow ground this in institutions that can carry it on from generation to generation. And I think education, it's not the only way to do this, but I think it's a really good way to do it. And so that's really what I'm trying to do now. But I want to stress, I don't think this belongs to academics, and I don't think academics are always particularly that interesting here. I don't want to hold them up on some pedestal. They're human beings, and they often have secret lives that are really interesting. They often have psychical lives, by the way, that are really interesting. But I don't want you to think that anything I'm saying somehow privileges academics. It just happens to be the institution I backed up into as a kid. It's where I sit now, and I think it's where I can have the most effect or change something in the most effective way. And so today I mean these months and these years, I'm talking a lot about what I call the superhumanities. And I mean that very seriously. I mean it in two senses. I mean our own humanity, which I think is actually a superhumanity with a transcendent dimension. But I also mean it in the sense of the humanities, the study of literature, religion, philosophy, art, these sorts of things. If you really look at the histories of each of these disciplines, what you discover very quickly is that the figures who are most revered and most read in those disciplines inevitably had altered states of mind and body and did their most creative work out of these altered states. I see this over and over again. For example, if you look at literature, some of our greatest writers were inevitably exactly the same people who were the most interested in anomalous phenomena. So Arthur Conan Doyle actually is a classic kind of iconic figure here, but he's not alone. I mean, literary geniuses are often exactly these people who are familiar with these states and these phenomena, and they write out of those states. And so when I use a phrase like the superhumanities, what I'm essentially arguing is that even the humanities that we talk about today, at least in the States, I'm not sure what they're called in England, actually. I know they're called other things in France and Germany. What do you call them in England?
Well, arts subjects or the humanities.
Yeah, okay. So it's a shared phrase. I mean, that's what they're called in the States. And they're dismissed really or relegated to the side of the STEM, what we call the STEM fields now, right? But I'm trying to say that actually one of the reasons we're sidelined today is because we're so freaking boring. And we've like crushed the human down to this sort of material, biological machine. And we see the human being as essentially just a collection of bad politics and ideologies and political identities, all of which are true. That's all true. But you can't just deny and deconstruct and expect to be heard. you also have to construct and create something positive. And so for me, the superhumanities is a way of talking about the humanities in a way that I think is actually very attractive, very weird, and really quite fantastic. Um, and so that's what I'm doing today is I'm looking into the history of things like philosophy and literature and religion and art and trying to uncover all of these strands in which the word superhuman is literally used. I mean, just to give you an example from the sciences, I'm sure some of you know this, but Alfred Russel Wallace, who co-founded evolutionary biology, used the word superhuman all over the place and was an avid proponent of spiritualism in the 1860s and 70s and 80s. So he's an example from the sciences. Another figure is Ernst Schrödinger, the great quantum physicist who wrote extensively about what he called the one mind. And so if you just dig into these histories, you just see this over and over and over again. And you realize that, oh my God, these states are what created these thinkers. And we've missed this. So for example, let me give you an example from the sciences before I go back to the humanities. So, I talk a lot about sort of the mystical dimensions of quantum mechanics and quantum physicists, and everybody thinks that was created in the 1970s in California. They all think that's a countercultural kind of hippie thing that Fritjof Capra or somebody invented. That is, I mean, Capra was important and was quite sophisticated, actually, still is sophisticated, but he did not start that conversation. The founders of quantum mechanics started that conversation. They're the ones who turned to mystical literature, and particularly in the East, but also Sufi literature and Christian mystical literature. They went directly to mystical literature to explain what they thought the implications of quantum mechanics were. So the physicists started it. It wasn't New Age hippies. And so that's just like one example of kind of the misunderstanding that I think exists. And when you go back to the humanities, I mean, you can turn to people like William James. You can look at people like Arthur Schopenhauer, who also, by the way, wrote extensively about animal magnetism and mediumship. Probably the most influential figure here in the modern world is Friedrich Nietzsche, of all people. Nietzsche is often read as a kind of angry atheist, but if you read his late work after he had his own mystical experience, the guy is an ecstatic, kind of deified Ubermensch, or someone moving towards an Ubermensch. And the superhuman literally translates, the Ubermenschliche is the superhuman. And you get that in English as the superhuman. You get that in French as the surhumain. You get that all through Europe in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. And you get it in the States in figures like William James, who also used the category of the superhuman. And then it just kind of goes away. It gets repressed. And it then surfaces again in the counterculture and in science fiction and ultimately comic books, of all places. And that's where it kind of sits today, is in these superhero films and these science fiction narratives. But it's actually a 19th century, and actually it's older than that. I mean, one of my arguments is that the whole history of religions is all about the superhuman. Religion is basically about human beings discovering their own transcendent core or nature, the fact that they're super and not just human. All of Christianity is really a debate about the superhumanity of one guy, right? The human and the divine natures of one Jewish rabbi. But you can look at any religion, and it's really about a series of memories or historical deposits of these same kind of superhuman experiences, and how those were interpreted and then ritualized and artistically represented and coded in text and stuff. And so that's that's kind of what I'm trying to do now, is look at um, this long picture and saying, really, this is what we've been about for millennia, not just 100 or so years. And if we could acknowledge this, we could not bring it back, as it were, but we could revitalize what we mean by the humanities and revitalize our own cultures and create something much more positive. And there are problems with it. I don't want to romanticize here. There are real problems with emphasizing the transcendent over the immanent that are very apparent in a figure like Nietzsche, for example, but are also very apparent in the religions, which have easily done as much damage and as much evil as they have done good. So, I mean, this is a complicated topic that I don't want to just slide over. But that's essentially what I'm doing now, Lance. I mean, I can stop there. I can keep going, but maybe we can open it up for questions. And I have
Well, I have a couple of things I'd like to say there in response to that, and I know we've got Peter Bruin and Suzanne Taylor on the chat list, and others are welcome to join in. I hope I'll sound a bit more optimistic about universities. I entirely agree. I mean, the great English playwright Tom Stoppard says, unless we get our philosophy right, we won't get our society right. We have to get the philosophy, and that is the thinkers in universities. They may not seem the most important people, but in a sense, they are like doctors. They're the priests of our time. Anyway, you know that in Edinburgh here, we developed the first chair in parapsychology, in Europe, in the Arthur Koestler chair. And you know that Chris Rowe at Northampton has, to my astonishment, 11 members of staff, and they're all operating, researching in and teaching parapsychology and so on. And when I was a young lecturer, I first started in 1972, no such departments existed anywhere in Britain, and I think anywhere in Europe. And now I think there are 7 or 8 universities. Maybe it's more, but some of these new universities, maybe it's 11 or 12 places where this stuff is being looked into. I don't mean it's not marginalized. I don't mean it's not poo-pooed, regarded as woo-woo, but at least we've got that. And you referred to publications. Well, I mean, something like the Journal of Consciousness Studies strikes me as being a proper, more or less peer-reviewed thing. Though to back up another point you made about the historicity of this, the SPR's journal was, those yellow volumes coming out every month since 1882, that's all pretty serious stuff. So it's kind of there, and there's a bit more of it than there was. I mean, am I being over optimistic?
Well, I hope not. All I know, Lance, is look, I spend my days in the gut of American higher education, and I have never ever seen in my entire life an advertisement for, a faculty position in this area.
Really?
No. And if I went to my provost and asked for one, I mean, he'd be kind and professional, but the answer would be absolutely not, I think. So yes, these inquiries have always existed in these smaller institutions in European cultures for 100, 150 years now, but we have yet to get them into the gut. We've yet to get them into the heart of our institutions, and that's really what I'm talking about. I could name institutions in the US in which this goes on too, but every single one of them, except for maybe DOPS at the University of Virginia, is in some ways marginalized and often is shut down as soon as the founders retire. It reabsorbed back into the university, which has nothing, again, to do with that topic. I mean, Duke is actually a really interesting case here. Duke University, of course, is where Ryan was for decades. But when he retired, they shut him down. They shut the place down. And now there's still interest there in the paranormal, but it's mostly in the humanities, frankly. It's in the English and in religion. But again, it's not enough to create a multi-generational
yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah.
In order not to hog it, Scott, could I ask you to unmute Peter Bruin and Suzanne Taylor? Because her question is a bit easier, can I ask Suzanne Taylor to tell us what she means about give them MDMA? Are you there, Suzanne?
Well, yes, here I am. Well, that's I had that thought decades ago, actually, when ecstasy first hit Los Angeles and we were smitten. Um, it takes you to your heart. And, once you're in your heart, the magic happens. So we were saying way back then, put it in the water supply.
Well, that is
Not a bad idea.
Okay, so let me talk about that, Suzanne. Let's talk not about MDMA per se, but so there is a kind of renaissance of psychedelic studies today, as I'm sure you're aware, and it is taking place in the universities, but not in the humanities. It's restricted to basically pharmaceutical interests, and it's linked to how to sell these things and turn them into products for the pharmaceutical industry to treat things like PSTD and depression and end of life care and things like that, which are all, of course, totally legitimate. But listen, I've talked to these scientists, Suzanne. I know these scientists, and I'm like, what are you doing? Like you go on and on about mystical experience. Well, why don't you talk to somebody who knows something about mystical? Why don't you hire a scholar of mystical literature and come in and really do this? And basically what they tell me is they've tried to do that. They understand that. They want to do that. But the funding agencies just lop it off because humanists don't know anything. We're not scientists. So there's a real issue here. There's a really serious issue going on about why are we essentially giving people experiences of God at the hands of medical professionals who know nothing about these things really, or who are not trained in these particular. And I'm not dismissing the integrity of these researchers. They're the highest integrity. But what I'm trying to say is there has been very little interaction with people who've given their whole lives to the study of these literatures in these states, and who know these states, by the way, personally. Academics are not walking heads. They have taken LSD, they have taken ayahuasca, they have taken mescaline. This stuff starts with them. Aldous Huxley was not a hippie. He was, and I'm not making fun of the hippies either. They did something really important too. But my point is that doesn't happen. That's not happening right now. Aldous Huxley is not driving the psychedelic renaissance. The pharmaceutical companies are. And that, I'm worried about that, So that's kind of my point.
That may be a bit of an answer to the MDMA suggestion, which was presented slightly lightheartedly, but I do see your point. I mean, it's like Soma in Brave New World. We could all be made happier and perhaps more open to the spiritual with a few changes in the water supply. I do see that. But just to move on a bit.
I'm sorry, Lance. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, I just say, Peter Bruin, you made a very good point here, but would you like to expound on it a tiny bit?
I'll try to. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Suzanne, but I thought your MDMA suggestion was a response to my question above, which was to do with the nature of reality, and particularly the nature of American reality. We're all sort of examiners, researchers into notions of reality here, particularly in this context. But sometimes I think at the moment I could do with a larger dose of what I would call real normal reality. And my question was, what practical contracts are possible that could produce a quantum shift back to a much needed reality for the Proud Boys? I'm asking on behalf of the planet.
Yeah, I'm certainly there too, Peter. I mean, we all want that. And that's kind of what, I guess part of what I'm trying to argue is you need this kind of stability, and you need this kind of long-range inquiry. You need stability to engage in that long-term inquiry. The altered states alone are not enough. They need to be somehow integrated into a stable culture and passed on from generation to generation. I think this is the genius of the religions, by the way, that they've managed to do this in some way. It's just that they then become exclusive. and then they also do real damage. And I think we have to come up with a way of talking about these things and thinking and embodying them that isn't that. But yeah, I listen. I live in Texas, Peter. I'm with you 100%. We're waiting. We're waiting 2 more weeks. 2 more weeks. We're
Well, thanks very much for that. We have a question from Christine Smith, Scott, and then perhaps you could also unmute Mary and Chris Lane so that we get the next one as well. So Christine, we see your question here. Do you think that the globalization of politics, economics, affairs requires the populations of Western countries to be dumbed down and encouraged of thinking of their lives in a mundane way? That's quite a strong question. Have I got it right?
Yeah. Yes, it's just the financial sector seem to have taken over people's lives in a huge way, and in order to have production units, I think there's a lot of dumbing down happened in education to stop people thinking that life could be more than just the treadmill and earning money and gaining stuff.
Does that resound with you, Jeffrey?
Yeah, that rings true. I often defend the notion of elitism, Christine. I think higher education is elitist through and through, and I think that's a good thing. When I bring somebody over to work on my air conditioner or work on my car or automobile or something, I want an expert. I want an elite. I want someone with elite knowledge to work on the AC unit or my Toyota. I don't want to just pull somebody off the street and say, hey, fix my brakes, right? But for some reason, when we turn to subjects like the meaning of life, we'll take anybody, apparently. And I just think that's sad and kind of pathetic. And so, I sometimes write about this metaphor of the ivory tower, which is used, at least in the States. Is it used in the UK to talk about? Yeah, it's usually used in a derogatory sense, that academics are kind of out of touch and they live behind or in this ivory tower. But actually, historically, that ivory tower has protected intellectuals from the public. And so I think it works both ways. I think real intellectuals do not fit into the broader society and need to be protected in some way.
Yeah.
And I think
it's not the fate of the intellectuals, it's more the people's own feelings about what their life is about. They're not encouraged. We're not getting taken to church in the same numbers as when I was younger, and kids aren't getting possibly introduced to that aspect of being human, that there's something that is transcendent. And a lot of television nowadays seems to cater to the lowest common denominator. There's not many kind of lifting up programs that you can hope to raise people's consciousness to more than just the mundane, and give views of different aspects that are available out there for everybody.
I mean, that's essentially why I wrote The Flip, Christine. I work with young people as undergraduates, and they're virtually all future scientists and doctors and engineers and stuff, and they think all this stuff is bunk. And much as you're describing there. So I sort of gave up giving them examples of religious figures or historical figures, and I turned to scientists and engineers who had had the same experiences. And that really gets their attention, because it's harder for them to deny that or to work around that when it's essentially one of their own. But I do think that's the reigning worldview. I think you're right about that. It's a kind of flat worldview that we're in right now.
That's a pity, isn't it? Yes. Mary and Chris, sorry, Christine. Mary and Chris Lane had an interesting question about Gary Schwartz and Dean Radin, whose work I know very well. Dean is coming to talk to us in this series, as you know. So what would you like to say, O'Lanes?
Yes, thank you. I think in this context, the question is really, these guys, I think Dean Radin, certainly Gary Schwartz, and I'm become a fan of his, are coming at this from a scientific angle, but I think they're making great efforts, aren't they, to move into the humanities, or at least present stuff that people doing humanities can very much relate to. But is there a synchronicity too with people like, I hope there are others, Philip Goff at Durham with panpsychism? That's very much obviously an approach from the humanities, but there's a big overlap, because I think the title of the Gary Schwartz edited American Association for Advanced Post-Materialist Science book is the title of the book is Consciousness Primary? And that's absolutely Philip Goff's line. So the question is, are the scientists doing something for us here? Oh
yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think so. I particularly, well, philosophy of mind, which is Phil's area, is, and neuroscience, I think is really important here, but also frankly, evolutionary biology. I mean, if you read enough into evolutionary biology, it's looking less and less random and more written, essentially. So I think all of these sciences can help us, but I think they need philosophical conversation partners, essentially, to articulate what the implications are. Absolutely, though. I mean, I couldn't agree more, actually.
We've had Philip Goff on this series. We're going to have him again. We're having Bernardo Kastrup, who goes this way. I'm trying to get Galen Strawson. I was astonished to discover there were philosophers who were doing that. We're getting Ian McGilchrist, and he, of course, has moved from a neuroscientist looking at the two halves of the brain to these more transcendent matters. I mean, some of it is going in our direction, I feel. I mean, there's more of it than there was.
Absolutely. The other neuroscientist who's fantastic here is Don Hoffman. I don't know if you know Hoffman's work, but he wrote this book called The Case Against Reality. And his essential argument is that, look, if Darwinian biology is true, then we've evolved not to see reality as it is. We've evolved to see it how we can adapt to it and use it. And so what we're seeing and sensing is certainly not what's there. And so he uses the sciences sort of to implode, the sciences, as it were. And for him, really good science is precisely a science that takes itself apart and to move forward. So I personally think, this is me as a humanist or a historian now, I think the number one shaper of the new religious imagination is the sciences. I think that's what we're seeing over the course of this last 100 years or so. When people have near-death experiences, they don't see the saints or the Virgin Mary anymore. They go into a hyper-dimensional reality, or they see the quantum flux or something. So it's the sciences that are shaping that experience. It's no longer Catholic devotionalism or Christian piety.
I mean, Max Planck, Albert Einstein, Schrödinger, as you mentioned, all these people seem to have had this other angle themselves, even though their professional lives made that marginalized. And Bernard Carr's another example, and I think there are lots of examples out there.
Oh yeah, Carr stuff.
Those of us who've worked in academia know that there are things you can say and there are things you can't say. I mean, I remember teaching poetry at the university and finding that you can talk about the iambic pentameters and the scansion. You can talk about the metaphorical structures, but if you ask people really seriously what they think some of these more abstract poems, it may just be poems like Wordsworth, are about, what they mean to them, how they think they relate to a philosophy of the world, what they mean transcendentally, there's an embarrassed silence. There's that so several of the speakers who've spoken have seemed to have confirmed that in education, that's rather what happens. It's not so much that it's not there, it's that it's not taken seriously or properly permitted, something like that.
Yeah,
I would have thought.
That's true.
We have Gillian F, who's asked a question here. Does she want to ask her question? She's asking about Shulgin. I don't know who Shulgin is.
I don't know if my microphone works, but it's not really a question. It was just a comment in relation to the drugs discussions earlier.
The drugs.
Shulgin had done a recipe book and diaries pretty much of his creation of various research chemicals, I think. So it was really in relation to that conversation. So I have no more to say about it.
Did he get any results? Sorry.
Yeah, I think he did. Did he not discover MDMA and ecstasy and such like that? So yeah, so quite interesting. And I think because of that, these works, they pop up. It's just striking me as everyone speaks that these works are coming from such different disciplines, you know, who's regarded as a scientist, who's not, what is regarded as research and what is not. And yet all of it is almost lost within, you know, one critique or another of not being taken seriously, whichever place it's coming from. So, you know, I'm just sort of thinking, twisting, my brain's been twisting from things like some of these sort of quite chemical research pieces of work back to works of people like Carlos Castaneda, even, which were, you know, people who were just sort of mixing and matching all sorts of philosophies within them. And I think, you know, a lot of these works have been ridiculed for one reason or another, and yet point to so many different things that we can be thinking about, you know, and fundamentally what even is reality within all of these things. So that's where my head's going, so I'll shut up now.
Well, I think, Jillian, I think your point's well taken. I mean, I don't know a lot about Shulgin. I know he was an American chemist, right? And he was very influential in the counterculture, kind of behind the scenes mostly. But that whole psychedelic current, all those psychedelic currents, which I think are really important, are precisely what you can't study or write about today. Like, I mean, we get applications from young people who want to come and do a PhD in religion and psychedelic culture, and we tell them, no, you can't do that. And the reason we tell them no isn't because we're not interested, it's we know they will never get a job. We know that. And so the fields have a way of suppressing particular inquiries. Let me give you another example. Take Aldous Huxley again. I don't know about UK, but in the States, we all read one Huxley book and we all read it in high school. And you know what it is. It's Brave New World. It's this really depressing dystopian novel that he wrote before he encountered mystical literature and before he encountered mescaline. And he wrote his own novel in answer to Brave New World with all his answers in it, called Island. Came out in 1963. It was his last novel. Guess what? Nobody reads it. Nobody even, okay, Suzanne read it. Okay. But my point is nobody assigns it in the high schools, you know?
I would just add one little factoid about it, which has stuck with me all these decades. On the island, which is this utopian society, they have some odd thing going on where they have these trained birds. You know, remember that, Jeffrey? So the birds are trained to go say whenever they want to, they say something. What they say, they've trained to say two things. One is attention,
right.
Come into the moment. And the other is the Spanish word for compassion, open your heart. The birds are squawking away all over this island, telling you to come to attention and open your heart.
Very lovely. Scott, could you unmute David Lorimer, please, who has a couple of points? David? No, he's still muted. There he is.
I'm now live, I think.
Yes.
Well, how nice to see you, Lance, and Jeff, and a few Edinburgh friends, Charlie, Robin Chapman Campbell, and others, and other network friends. Very, very, very interesting. Well, my 2 points have actually slightly expanded. I've just got a few short observations to make, and then I have a question. I'll start with Island. I assigned Island to read when I was teaching at Winchester. And so there's one exception. I didn't do Brave New World, and I did Island, and the boys enjoyed it. And I think Huxley warned Timothy Leary, and maybe you who told me this, that if it got too popular, then everything, all the research and everything would get shut down. And that's exactly what happened. And now it's coming back. And what I find interesting is that quite a number of the research summaries I've read will tell you that it's the mystical experience which has the transformational effect.
Yeah.
And I think that's so interesting. So a couple of other things. Harvard was offered a chair of psychical research in 1911, the year after William James died. And even then, they refused to take the money.
Yeah.
And so, what has changed? You might ask yourself. And I can think of a number of of courses, exactly as you say, in UK universities. There was a Angela Byrne, I think, was doing course at University of Kent, closed down. And when, you're right, when people finished, the person who started it up, Nicholas Goodrich Clark, who's a Centre for Esoteric Studies at Exeter University, he died, got closed down. And so I think that's slightly depressing. But on the other hand, as Lance was saying, you know, there maybe your PhD students could get a job if one could sort of ratchet the thing up in the way that Lance has suggested, with all the doctorates. I think there's 100 doctorates from University of Edinburgh. And I'm rambling a bit, but I have two more observations and then my question. One observation was about Philip Goff. He won't go here. He won't go look at the experiences. He's at Durham University, and he'd get closed down if he starts talking about mystical experience. So he's a panpsychist and very interesting. But we grilled him a bit when he spoke to the network a few months ago. But so that's a kind of the warning flag is up. And then I wanted just to draw attention to the Gifford lectures, you know, on natural religion in Scottish universities. And Lance, why don't we try and get Jeff invited by St Andrews or Edinburgh, you know, to give some Gifford lectures.
Good thing.
You can follow on William James. So we can maybe correspond about that and see if we can persuade them. And then my question, Jeff, is how much interest is there in the States in new thought? Because if you look at these ideas you've been talking about, super consciousness, transcendence, Ralph Waldo Trine, Thomas Troward, Charles Harnell, then it goes down to Napoleon Hill, Earl Nightingale, and so on. They had this whole tradition of talking about the sort of super conscious, and it sort of disappeared after the rise of behaviorism. Is there any mileage in that culturally, do you think?
So there is on a popular level, David, but not on an intellectual level. It's usually, so there's a huge church here in Houston, actually, that's basically a kind of well, there's a new thought, there's an actual new thought church, but there's also another very large church that's basically a similar kind of message. But what most intellectuals do with that is they align it with what's called the prosperity gospel.
Oh, yeah.
As a way of bringing it down.
Right.
You know, it's God's going to make me rich, and I can wish what I want or intend what I want, and I'm going to get what I want. So it kind of gets linked to this kind of grotesque materialism or capitalism in a way. But those currents you're talking about are very much there, and they're very important, and they're talked about by historians. I mean, I've read about all those figures in my colleagues' work, but they're not known in the broader public. So,
and there was another book that came out in 1890, which nobody knows about, The Law of Psychic Phenomena.
Yeah.
By God, the name escapes me for the moment. Thomas J. Hudson, and it was incredibly influential on New Thought movement people at the time. And there was a particular interest just before Freud came along in how do we understand not only hypnosis, but also savantism. How is it that people can produce these prodigious mathematical feats if there isn't a universal mind? That was one of the questions they were asking themselves.
Yeah. So the most sophisticated writer today on New Thought, there's two of them. One is a woman named Catherine Albanese, who is retired now. She was at UC Santa Barbara, and she wrote this big tome called A Republic of Mind and Spirit, which I think is the best history of esoteric thinking in the US probably ever written.
Ah, interesting.
And the other author is a man named Mitch Horowitz, who kind of wears the New Age label proudly and tries to articulate it in very sophisticated ways. He kind of comes from the publishing world, but now he's really a speaker and a teacher, and his stuff's actually very good. And he's written about New Thought and the prosperity materials in a way that I think is very, very plausible and very, very, very complex.
Scott, do you think you could unmute Jessica Cornet, please?
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thanks very much, David. Thanks, Jeffrey, there. There's a Peter Bruin, but I'm just going to ask Jessica. Peter Bruin has a very down-to-earth question in the chat, as you'll see at 8:14 there, and Jessica has a more sort of transcendent question. Let's take her first. Jessica, would you like to ask this question?
Hi there. I didn't really have a question. I sort of just made a comment on how I feel that these experiences are mostly ridiculed because I think most people have not had transcendent experiences and therefore don't really understand what we mean by them. And those who have had these experiences generally tend to keep to themselves, as they think that they're sort of taboo. These are taboo sort of topics, so they'd rather not talk about them. So yeah, that was my comment, really.
So let me say two things there, Jessica, that are both really important.
Yeah.
You know, one is, this goes back to the elitism or the esotericism of this topic. You know, there is this long-standing observation in the history of religions that you have to be in a particular state of consciousness to understand that state of consciousness. You know, not everybody can hear you. This is, you know, Jesus says, let those who have ears hear. But of course, that means most people don't have ears to hear. And so we operate in our modern democracies with, I think, the false notion that everybody can hear anything and can absorb any idea. And I just think that's false. I think it's fundamentally false. And particularly when you get in these areas, if you haven't had such an experience, this stuff sounds crazy.
Yeah.
But if you've had such an experience, it's obvious.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that we really have to take that in and take that seriously. Okay. So the second thing I would say is, it just flew out of my head, I'm afraid.
No, bad luck.
It'll come back to me. But
people who
I just
do or don't feel comfortable talking about it. I mean, when I started into this stuff, well, okay, I'll just say this. I had a realization, Jessica, when I started looking into this stuff 40 years ago, suddenly occurred to me like a sort of vision that if you get 4 people together and you're talking around this sort of area, most of them will say nothing about it and nothing about themselves. But if you force them to do so, there will certainly be at least one who has had an interesting mystical or parapsychological experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
1 in 4, don't you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, 100%. And I've had people reaching out to me. I'm doing research on spontaneous spiritual awakening experiences. And I've had many people reach out to me telling me that it's the first time that they've ever felt that they've been able to actually discuss one of the most powerful experiences that they've ever had. So I know that once you give people that platform, then actually you soon realize that more people have these experiences than we like to think. I still think, however, that on the grand scheme of, in the world, I think it's still a minority to some extent. So yeah.
But it's a big minority. Jeffrey, you had another point, and after that, we'll just go back to Peter.
It came back to me. So I think this is why people don't talk about them in public, Jessica, one reason. David, I might have said this to your group already, so forgive the repetition, but 10 years ago, if you would have asked me this question, I would have naively said something like, well, if we talk about these stories long enough, we'll figure them out. We'll be able to explain them. They'll become sensible, or they'll become rational, or somehow. I just don't believe that anymore. I think the more a person tells you his or her story, the stranger it gets. Like when someone writes me and tells me their story, I know the first thing I know is that's not the full story. They're already self-censoring, and if they trust me enough, then they'll tell me a story on top of the story that makes it just kind of batshit crazy, but it's actually what happened to them. Yeah. It's really what happened. And then if they trust you more, they'll tell you more and more. And it just gets more and more strange. It never makes sense. And I think that's why people self-censor, is they recognize on some fundamental level that what happened to them cannot be shoved into this box that is our culture or our public understanding of what the real is. And that's kind of scary.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's
Sorry, Jessica, go on.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one last point, that I do think it's our responsibility to talk openly about these experiences that we've had, so that more people will feel inclined to do the same, and thus, you know, be happier in life and be more open about such wonderful, blissful experiences, and yeah, cause a change in action.
I think we're all right behind you on that. Perhaps you could think in, Scott, about unmuting Gavin, but before you do that, or while you're doing that, did Peter have a point that he wanted to make about the CIA there?
I did, but I was my thoughts been diverted, and responding to both thoughts just expressed by the last two speakers, by Jeffrey and Jessica. Going right back to the beginning of your chat, Jeffrey, I was really impressed when you talked about what you might call authentic narrators, people that you can trust, people who told you something which was transformational for you. And I think for those of us who have had perhaps at best only marginal transcendental or spiritual experiences, that's the best we can get to until it slaps us on the jaw. I mean, as an example of that, and I think it's relevant, I was fortunate a few years ago to form a relationship with two guys out in Arizona. They're called the Navajo Angels. I met them at the International UFO Congress, and from the first second, we mutually seemed to feel that we were in touch with each other. I don't want to sound too hippie, but this is what it was. But Stan and John worked as the paranormal operators for the Navajo Nation. It had started, they got the jobs because an old woman had complained to the head of the Navajo service that there was a skinwalker who was bothering her around her hogan. And the service had sent out a young operator who had treated the woman rather disrespectfully. So she had complained vociferously to the head of the service, and he took it seriously. And he, at that point, decided to establish a paranormal service within the Navajo Rangers. The Navajo Rangers have a very wide skill set. That's everything from police work to, in their case, you know, they could do rescues, they could do firearms work, all sorts of stuff. But Stan and John were appointed as the Navajo Rangers to look at the weird stuff. They were the only guys who applied for the jobs because they were the only two non-full blood, I'm using their terminology, non-full blood Navajo. They came from split cultures, and they weren't quite as terrified of the weird stuff as John and Stan were. But when I got to know them, they took me out on my birthday, and they told me stories that were just absolutely off the chart, from time shifts to skinwalker events that they had witnessed, hauntings, UFO landings, absolutely everything. And I believed every word of it. And I believed it because I looked into their eyes and I realized that these were guys who just didn't tell you lies. They didn't have the filter that Jessica was, I think, talking about. If they trusted you, they were very direct with you. And then something more than universal opens up, something absolutely extraordinary opens up. And I hope that wasn't taking up too much time sharing that thought. But the reliable narrator is so important in a world where the most unreliable narrator ever is just about to leave the presidency of the United States. It's been so damaging to the culture of your country and to the world at large. And that's why truth and direct communication and believing the people that you maybe come to believe you should believe is incredibly important. And that was nothing to do with my earlier thought, which was that a lot of the advanced academic work on I'm generalizing now, the weird stuff was done in partnership between the CIA and the Stanford Research Institute back in the 70s and 80s. With Stargate Project, ESP, PK, etc. And it's very sad that academia has supported essentially warfare-related anomalous work. Sorry, that's...
No, interesting, very interesting. Jeffrey, do you have a comment on that, or should we move on to Gavin?
Well, so I could speak to any of that, Peter. I don't know what you want to do, Lance. You want to move on to Gavin, or you want me to speak to what?
No, if you have something to say to Peter's point, please say it.
Yeah, well, there's so much there. First of all, Peter, I assume you've read Hunt for the Skinwalker?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so I know both of those authors. They're totally reliable. That stuff's, very, very real. What's so interesting about the Skinwalker Ranch case is they sent a scientific team in for like 3 years, and they just got the crap haunted out of them, and they got zero scientific evidence. There was just no way to pick any of this up with scientific instruments, but they witnessed it themselves over and over and over again. So the human being is somehow the ultimate scientific instrument, is the way I would put it there. The CIA stuff, it's not just the CIA, by the way, it's all branches of the American military were involved in remote viewing and now in the UFO stuff, which is all over the news in the US. I mean, this is no longer even a secret. I get asked about that all the time. My reply is always the same. What's so frustrating to me about that are all the security clearances that prevent us from really ever understanding it. When I engage in research in the humanities, I have to use many, many footnotes so other people can come on my work and go to the same sources and draw their own conclusions. We have a shared kind of communal conversation going on. That is precisely what you don't have with all of this military and intelligence involvement in the paranormal. It's intentionally locked behind security clearances and security walls, and there is no way to figure out what's going on. And so that to me is just a kind of non-starter.
Although Trump has actually one of the last things he signed off on was that the military have to declare what they know in the next 180 days and counting.
Well, yeah, and we'll see if they do that.
I know.
I mean, yeah.
Okay, well, moving on to that, that's great. Thanks, Jeff. There's a lot there, I think. Then what about Gavin now? Is he still here, Gavin?
Yes.
Yes, you had a point here about myth and the superhuman part is sort of top-down explanations and science is bottom-up explanations for us. And your question was, what should science learn from myth and the superhuman? Do you want to add to that for a moment, or is that the question?
Yes, I mean, essentially, I suppose that human beings started with religion and mythology, and science sort of came along to say, those ways of explaining what we are and how we are deficient, and we can do better than that. And so we start from the bottom and work out what makes us up and what the world is constructed of and what we're constructed of. And slowly we'll build all of these layers together and we'll have the whole picture. But one of the themes of these talks has always been that there was some baby in the bathwater. And we've lost some of that. And one of the things, obviously, that we've talked about is whether the nature of consciousness is something that science really has got any kind of a handle on. But I suppose it was the question was, what are the things that science, in its bid to kind of clear the deck and explain everything, and what has it lost from the myth making and this fascination with the superhuman or the godly? What are the things we've lost? What has science lost by taking that approach? What can it learn?
Well, okay, so let me just gently correct one thing you said and then move to answer your question. I don't think the religions begin with legend and myth. I think the religions begin with human experiences that are anomalous, and then those legends and myths are told to explain those experiences. So I think there's an experiential core behind all of this folklore and all of this mythology that is probably impossible to get to, but I think that's where everything starts, with empirical experience. Now, what has science lost? I think this is what Phil Goff has done so well. I mean, this is Galileo's error, Gavin. Galileo's error is basically the decision to not talk about subjectivity and to only look at objects that can be measured and mathematized and manipulated, and to call that science, and to essentially idolize objectivity, as it were, study of objects, and to try to remove subjectivity or the subject as much as possible. And of course, what's lost there over the last few hundred years is the subject. It's you, it's me, it's the scientist himself or herself. So we know more and more about the physical world of objects, and we know less and less about ourselves. That's essentially where we're at. And it's that splitting that has been, I think, so devastating to Western culture in the long run. It doesn't deny the things that science can do, but I just think it's a fundamental mistake to say, because we can make refrigerators and smartphones, therefore scientific materialism is true. It doesn't follow at all. And all science, I've never met a scientist, maybe you have, I've never met a scientist who wasn't a human being. So I actually think the sciences are a subdivision of the humanities. And I think that's the way we should think about it. All scientific knowledge is human knowledge. All mathematics is coming from the human mind. It all goes back to the human. And that's precisely what's been taken off the table. And I think that's what we need to bring back on the table.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you, Gavin, for the question. Because Pascal Michael, if they're still with us, has a question just to this point that you'll see it against 8:30 in the chat. Belief may well stem from experiences such as NDEs. I mean, I always think that Jesus and people like that had paranormal experiences, and people saw them healing and seeing things that nobody else could see, and then made a religion out of it. It is exactly the way around Jeffrey thinks. So Pascal, is that what you are trying to say here? Have I got that right?
Yeah, you got it right.
Can you hear me?
Where are you? I can't see you. We can hear you, yes.
Hello.
Hello, have I got it? Are you right? I mean, things arise from human experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of just making the point that, we're having a discussion about it being such this divisive scenario of those who have these experiences that obviously much more sympathetic than it drives kind of disbelief.
Can you turn your volume up, Pascal?
Is that better? Is that better like that?
No, I'm afraid we've sort of lost you.
Oh. That's unfortunate.
I can just hear.
You did a good job of reading my comment. So perhaps Jeffrey, he seemed to be nodding.
Okay, Jeffrey, can you answer that question anyway? Thanks, Pascal.
Wait, I can read his comment.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I think Pascal and Greg, whom I know, by the way, I think that's essentially correct. I think these belief systems come from actual experiences. And I think the function of belief is precisely to give people who have not had the experience some kind of close-up experience of it that's indirect. You can kind of approximate the experience through belief, even though you haven't had an experience yourself like that. I think that's what essentially religion is. It's sort of twice removed from the actual experience, but it's still encoding the experience in some ways. And by the way, I think what's related here, I'm not a particularly gifted person paranormally or psychically. I'm kind of a dud, to be honest. But I've talked to so many people and gotten so close to these things. I just have no doubt about them. And I just kind of think it's irrelevant whether they happen to me or not now. I just think that's a total non-issue. I simply don't care. The species as a whole is having these experiences every second of every day of every year forever. They're everywhere. We're swimming in them right now. So to me, that's the power and the beauty of this. And that's really what I mean by the superhumanities. It's the whole shebang I'm talking about, not this or that person.
Yes, I like that very much, I have to say. I mean, I've always rather thought that, everything begins, I mean, Philip Goff will say that everything begins with consciousness. The only thing we're certain of is consciousness, and consciousness is what we have, which enables us to have experiences. And to go back to Jesus, I mean, clearly, the apostles and everybody thought, wow, what a guy. We have the experience of him, and look at the experiences he's having. This is all quite personal before it's turned in. And then St. Paul has the experience, apparently, he's knocked off his horse. And then the religion develops from there, and it's rather different from the original. Well, listen, I was thinking that perhaps we've the infinite amount more we could say. If anybody wishes to be unmuted and say something, please let them do it. Otherwise, this is going to be continued by other means to some extent. First of all, someone has asked, Eva has asked if you can get a recording of the meeting. The answer is yes, you can. You only have to ask Scott at the top of your screens there, who's in charge of this, and recordings of this meeting are possible. It's also going to be continued in another way, among them, that I sincerely hope that we'll get Jeffrey back. But also, I'll be talking next week. I'm not as good as Jeff, but here I am, and I will be talking about mysticism, spirituality, and everyday life. And some of what I have to say will bounce straight off what Jeff is saying here. And I hope that these 12 lectures in this winter series, these Tuesday talks, will work in that interactive way. And we always want to hear from you, and people are, of course, allowed to write to me and others at the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre. I will always reply. Robert Riddle was waving and wanted to say something, and he's very welcome if he can be unmuted. That's you, Robert, I think. No.
I think you muted yourself. Unmute.
There you are. We can hear you now, I think.
Okay. Can I don't seem to be able to unmute myself. You're unmuted now.
We can hear you.
Now you're muted.
Just muted himself again.
Just keep talking.
Okay. It's just, I'd like to ask Jeffrey, I feel he must have been in touch with Dr. Ebden Alexander, the neurosurgeon, who was a complete atheist, so far as I understand, until he had that near-death experience. And since then, he's been a changed man. And he's written at least 2 books, one of which is called Proof of Heaven. Is there anything you could tell me about him? I'm quite fascinated by what he says.
Yeah, so I mean, I have corresponded with Dr. Alexander a little, and I've read both of those books you're referring to. I would say this. So the question for me is, why does he write a book and it sells 1 million copies, and I write a book and it sells 2,000 copies?
Good question.
Yeah, and I am jealous, by the way. I own my, well, okay, so there's one copy. So, but here's the answer to that, Robert. Eben is a neurosurgeon.
Yeah.
And he inhabits the materialist scientific framework of the culture.
Yes.
And so his story is a true conversion story from the dominant paradigm of our culture to an alternate paradigm that's actually really interesting. And it sells a lot of books because it's essentially the conversion story of the time, where what I or someone else is trying to say, we don't occupy that cultural central space, and so we don't get to have that kind of attention.
Right.
Let me put it this way. People often ask me, basically the question they ask me can be translated this way: how do you get away with saying these things? That's really what they want to know. And what I always say is, it's all about the politics of knowledge. If I were a physicist, and I know Bernard Carr's a physicist and says these things, but generally physicists won't say any of these things, even if they believe them or think them, because they're at the very top of the politics of knowledge in the academy. It's physics and cosmology, and then it's chemistry, and then it's biology, and then it's sociology, and then it's you know, humanities, and religion is somewhere under your screen, you know, we're in the dirt somewhere. So basically, the more alive something is, the less prestige it has, and the more dead it is or abstract it is, the more prestige it has. And where you sit on those politics of knowledge will determine what you can say and how you can say it. And what's interesting about Eben Alexander is he's at the very top of the politics of knowledge, and yet he said the things that I'm trying to say down here. And so it's that radical flip or that radical conversion that I think makes his story so important. So that's what I would say about him.
Yeah, interesting.
Well, just thank you very much, everybody. Can I, yeah, sorry, was there one little last wave of the hand down there? Last one, please, Suzanne Taylor.
Well, you know, I was actually surprised at this presentation. I learned that academia is a tough place. I didn't know that, but the world is a tough place. And what we're in the throes of trying to go from this materialist perspective to this spiritual perspective, however you want to describe that shift. But that's what's going on. And, you know, academia has a heavy dose of that. Oh, well, it just seems like the same as everything. And this new reality is bubbling up to the surface. It's being born.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Suzanne, the only thing I would say is, I don't think at least I'm not trying to move from materialist to a spiritual worldview. I'm trying to move from a materialist scientific paradigm to a paradigm that can embrace the sciences of materialism and all these spiritual experiences. I think we want an integration here. We don't want to forget about all the things we've learned over the last couple hundred years, but we want to integrate that into a bigger worldview. I think too often there's a binary here that I think we just need to get past. So that's what I would say.
Okay, listen, somebody's told me that Isabella has been trying to say something. Is that true? Perhaps we could unmute Isabella. We can't go on too long. And then perhaps one more and that'll be it. Isabella, could you be unmuted, Scott?
Yes.
Can you hear? Good. Hello. It's quite a strange question in one sense. I think I'm confused about the paranormal because what I don't understand, is it the mortal or the immortal part of the human being who has this experience, or is it the total being who has this experience?
Well, Jeffrey, there's an easy question for you to answer.
Sorry.
Well, listen, first of all, if you're not confused by the paranormal, you clearly don't understand it. Anybody who says that they're not confused, they're either lying or they don't understand the situation. So that's a deep philosophical question, Isabella. I think I define a paranormal event as an event that has both a mental or spiritual component and a physical or environmental component, and they're clearly corresponded or relating in some way. If someone just has a pure spiritual experience, it's not paranormal. And if something purely physical happens, it's not paranormal. Those two things have to be happening in tandem for me to give my attention to it. So I think those experiences break down this binary between what is mortal and immortal, or what is spiritual and physical. I think that's the whole point of these experiences. I think they're trying to confuse us. They're trying to get our attention. They're trying to say, please stop thinking it's an either or, and please start to consider that it's a both and. I think that's really what they're about on some deep level.
Thank you.
That is a great answer. Thank you very much indeed. Listen, I can't stop without allowing a final word, after which I will have the final word, of course, and then Jeffrey Russell. But very briefly, my predecessor as chairman of the Arthur Conan Doyle Center is present, Anne Traherne, and she has put into the chat, may I make a comment? And I cannot refuse that. Could she be unmuted so that we can hear the word ex cathedra from Anne?
Thank you, Lance, and thank you, Jeffrey. Wonderful evening, thoroughly enjoying it. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make an observation, really, because I agree with your thinking, your philosophy. You know, you started off saying that, you know, those in the great literature and art world, you know, they have these moments of brilliance that seems to come out of the ether. And I think the same is true of religion as well. We were talking about religion as well, about it's people that have an experience. They either go into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, or they sit under a tree or whatever, but they have this experience, and then they write about it, and then it becomes a religion. Or in science or literature or whatever, they have this eureka moment. So in other words, the information is not coming from them, and therefore it's not coming from academia. It's simply that it needs academia to give it the status, give it the
acceptance,
credibility to get that out to the masses. And I was simply wanting to add, just like Peter did earlier, a sort of experiential comment, because I am clearly not an academic nor a scientist, but I do have psychical experiences, and I have had that a transformational experience as well. But something that I wanted to say, because you mentioned scientists are people first and foremost, and I'm trying to think, 2018, I had a scientist email me out of the blue and said he realized he had received information that didn't come from his head. And he was actually studying ways to, it was all about the eco stuff. It was about plastics in the ocean and about energy, and that was his field. And he sort of wrote to me confidentially and said, I've had this information and I know it didn't come from me and it didn't come from my studies. And, you know, I'm writing to say, can you help me? Does this happen? And so I sort of gave my explanation. And then there was another one and another one. And so I realized my job is one of a facilitator and one of getting the communication out to people. And so I have to just be aware enough that something is happening. Not anything that I understand, but I have to be aware that something is happening and I am being used as a tool to make that happen. So to cut a long story short, eventually there were 6 of them. They came from the US, from Holland, from Italy, one from England, one from Scotland, and I think that's about it. And they all wrote to me independently saying that they had all had a similar experience, that they were receiving information that hadn't come from their academic studies. And could I help them just to understand how this works? Now, I could do a bit of that, but I realized my job was to put them all together. And believe it or not, they all came to the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre and met for the first time. And it was nothing to do with psychic or mediumistic stuff. It was about science. And all I did was put them together. So I think the scientists are having these experiences and are using it for the benefit of the planet, I think, and humanity. But I'll be writing about that. So I can't mention any names at the moment, but that's something's happening.
I think that's fantastic. But I can almost guarantee you none of those scientists will admit where they got their information.
Correct.
When they go to write a journal article or write in their professional organizations. And I think that's what has to change.
Yeah.
That's kind of my point. The same exact things happen in the humanities, by the way. And generally people won't admit where, sometimes they will actually, they write about it in a journal or a essay, but then we quickly forget that and we just pretend they made up the idea or made up the piece of literature when in fact it was essentially channeled.
Yes, or they're the geniuses.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is 9 o'clock. I did want to bring the discussion to an end, but I have to. And I want to thank everybody, especially Jeffrey, for such a wonderful evening. That was absolutely great. I've already told you that we can carry on the conversation next week. And as you probably know, on Saturday evenings at the same time, we have the mediumship demonstrations at the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre. So there's plenty of stuff. And my last point is going to be an optimistic point. The negative is that Wikipedia always says nasty things about anything alternative or spiritual or whatever, and we've got to do something about that. But the good point is that Netflix has just produced a series, which many of you may know about, and I've seen most of, called Surviving Death, which is pretty good. And well, at the very, Peter Bruin saying mouthing it's terrible, thank God he's muted. It isn't perfect, but at least it isn't negative and skeptical and cynical and sarcastic about what we do. At least it is opening minds in that direction. It couldn't have happened 30 years ago. So we do have to say thank you to that. Netflix is at least as big as Wikipedia, so there. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to bring this to an end, and we can all be in touch in various ways. And Jeffrey, I hope we'll see you again soon.
Okay, thank you all. Thanks for
Thank
spending
you.
some time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.